Rain drifted over the city in a thin, icy mist, blurring the streetlights into pale halos and making every passing vehicle look almost identical. A worn sedan slowed the instant red and blue lights flared behind it, then eased carefully toward the curb. Behind the wheel, a black woman in a plain gray coat placed both hands where they could be seen. Her posture remained straight. Her breathing stayed even. She did not flinch. She did not argue. She simply waited with the controlled patience of someone who had faced dangerous situations many times before, though never one quite like this. A young officer approached with a smirk already forming on his face. His eyes swept over her modest blazer, her aging car, and the quiet street around them before he declared, with almost visible satisfaction, that the vehicle looked suspicious enough to search. What none of the officers understood was that the woman behind the wheel carried federal authority far beyond anything they imagined. Nor did they realize that their careless decision was about to bring an entire classified operation crashing into the open. Soon, a convoy of federal vehicles would surge down the avenue, sirens shaking the windows along the block. The street would fall into a silence so complete that it would feel as though the whole city had stopped breathing. Only then would the officers understand whom they had insulted and what their arrogance had nearly destroyed. The city had been losing money and confidence for a long time. Armored transport trucks were being attacked with surgical precision, disappearing along with cash reserves intended for regional banks. Each robbery left investigators with almost nothing. There were no useful fingerprints, no witnesses willing to speak, no clear pattern that local detectives could assemble from the scattered pieces. The crimes appeared random only to those examining them one at a time. From a broader perspective, however, a disciplined structure slowly emerged. The robberies were coordinated, carefully timed, and connected by details subtle enough to escape anyone who did not know exactly where to look. A joint task force was quietly formed between the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States Marshals Service. The case was classified so tightly that even senior officials in the city's police department were kept unaware of its existence. The operation was called Iron Verdict. Field command was entrusted to Deputy United States Marshal Camille Langston, a woman whose reputation inside federal law enforcement bordered on legendary, despite her lifelong preference for remaining outside the headlines. Camille had spent her career pursuing fugitives, dismantling trafficking networks, and entering criminal organizations that many agents would not approach without overwhelming support. She had built that career without theatrics and without demanding recognition from anyone. Those who worked beside her always described the same qualities. She remained calm under pressure that would break most people. She could read a room before others had even noticed the danger forming. And she had no interest in proving her authority to people determined to underestimate her. Camille had learned long ago that true competence did not need volume. It revealed itself in decisions, restraint, and the ability to remain focused when everyone else lost control. Her career had begun in courthouse security, where she performed quiet assignments that rarely earned praise. From there, she worked her way onto fugitive task forces and increasingly sensitive operations. She tracked dangerous men through swamps, abandoned factories, unfamiliar cities, and forgotten industrial corridors. Wherever the work took her, she arrived with the same clear-eyed concentration that made her superiors trust her with cases too delicate to hand to almost anyone else. She had testified repeatedly in federal court, trained younger agents who later led teams of their own, and declined opportunities to leave the field for administrative positions. A desk might have offered safety and prestige, but Camille had never entered federal service for either one. Without intending to, she became the person other agents hoped would take command whenever a case mattered too much to fail. Iron Verdict was one of those cases. For the assignment, Camille worked deep undercover. She drove an unremarkable sedan borrowed from a federal vehicle pool because it disappeared naturally into traffic. She dressed plainly, carried nothing visible that marked her as law enforcement, and moved through the city like an exhausted commuter returning from work. Local police had not been told who she was or what she was doing. That secrecy was deliberate. Information had already leaked from inside a precinct and reached people connected to the robbery crew, costing the task force a valuable opportunity. No one knew how deeply the corruption or carelessness extended, so the operation's leadership restricted knowledge to a narrow circle. The task force expected a courier connected to the robbery organization to make a delivery. Camille's role was simple in theory: observe the courier, follow without detection, and report where the money trail led. In practice, nothing about the operation was simple. Analysts had reviewed financial records, traced serial numbers from stolen currency, examined surveillance photographs, and built a map connecting robberies that had initially seemed unrelated. The organization behind them operated with near military discipline. Camille had identified the courier's route through this particular neighborhood after noticing a detail buried inside countless surveillance images. Others had overlooked it. She had not. The operation depended on that observation finally paying off. She never expected to become the reason it nearly failed. Elsewhere on the same road, 3 city police officers were searching for something to break the boredom of a quiet patrol. Their supervisor, Sergeant Brock Hensley, had developed a reputation that carried none of Camille's honor. He was known for cutting corners and enjoying the psychological advantage his badge gave him over ordinary citizens. Experience had not made him wiser. It had simply made him comfortable with shortcuts that newer officers were still cautious enough to avoid. I trusted his instincts more than written policy, even when those instincts were built on assumption rather than evidence. Beside him rode Officer Reed Callahan, whose temper had already produced formal complaints. Witnesses in those earlier encounters had described the same pattern. Reed escalated quickly, spoke over civilians, and treated disagreement as a threat to his authority. Many officers avoided working with him when they could. Brock never seemed troubled by the reputation following his partner from shift to shift. The third officer was Nolan Vance, a rookie eager to impress the 2 men beside him. Nolan admired Brock with the uncomplicated devotion inexperienced officers sometimes give the loudest person in the room, mistaking arrogance for leadership and certainty for competence. He also liked recording encounters on his phone, imagining that the footage might earn attention online. Instead of viewing citizens as people deserving care, he had begun treating patrol work as a stage. Together, the 3 men represented the kind of undisciplined authority that made honest police work harder for everyone. When they saw an aging sedan driven by a black woman, they decided, without evidence, that it looked like an easy reason for a stop. They had no idea what they were about to set in motion. The lights appeared behind Camille without warning. She responded exactly as a trained undercover officer should. She signaled, moved smoothly toward the shoulder, and stopped where the road allowed. Her hand settled immediately on the steering wheel, fingers open and visible. She understood better than most how rapidly a routine encounter could turn dangerous once fear and assumption replaced judgment. She had taught younger agents to maintain exactly this kind of control. Now she practiced it herself. Brock approached first, his flashlight cutting through the rain. From the moment he reached the window, he focused on details unrelated to any legitimate traffic violation. He commented on the registration as though it personally offended him. He criticized the condition of the sedan, and he studied Camille with the narrow suspicion of a man who had chosen his conclusion before asking his first question. Camille remained composed. "What is the reason for the stop, Sergeant?" she asked. Brock hesitated. It was brief, but long enough for her to know that he had no clear answer. He finally claimed the car matched a general profile connected to suspicious activity in the area, using language vague enough to justify almost anything and precise enough to prove nothing. He circled the sedan, dragging the beam of his flashlight across the hood, tires, and faint rust around the wheel well. Each ordinary imperfection seemed to strengthen a story that existed only in his mind. When he returned to the window, he asked where she was going. "Home from work," Camille replied. It was true even if it was not the entire truth. Brock stared at her as though the simplicity of the answer made it suspicious. "What kind of work keeps you out here in weather like this?" "Government work." She kept the answer intentionally broad, revealing more could compromise the operation already unfolding around them. Instead of easing Brock's suspicion, the mention of government work sharpened it. High exchanged a glance with Reed. Camille recognized it instantly. The silent agreement of 2 men who had decided not to believe her before giving her any chance to prove herself. Brock demanded her identification again, though she had already provided it. He held it under the flashlight far longer than any routine check required, studying it as if persistence might make something incriminating appear. Reed leaned toward the passenger side and fired questions at her in rapid succession. Where had she come from? Where was she going? Why was she so calm? He left no space for complete answers. The questions were not meant to gather information. They were designed to provoke a reaction he could later describe as suspicious. Behind them, Nolan had already raised his phone. He angled it toward Camille's window and whispered commentary as though he were creating entertainment rather than documenting an official encounter. She doesn't exactly look like someone with authority, he murmured. He intended the remark for Reed. Camille heard every word. She did not respond, though something in her gaze hardened. None of the officers knew that a concealed federal surveillance camera inside her dashboard was recording the encounter. The footage was being transmitted to a mobile command unit nearby, where federal agents watched in disbelief as their field commander was treated like a criminal. Inside the trunk rested a locked case containing surveillance equipment and preliminary evidence connected directly to Iron Verdict. To an untrained eye, the case looked ordinary. To the task force, its contents represented the foundation of an operation that had taken enormous effort to build. It needed to remain secure. It needed to remain unseen. The moment Reed mentioned the trunk, Brock's attention shifted toward it. He sensed another opportunity to escalate and justify the aggressive posture he had already adopted in front of his rookie. "Open the trunk," he ordered, "and explain what's in the case." Camille's voice remained calm. "I cannot do that. The contents are connected to an active federal matter." Brock reacted as though she had insulted him. "If you don't cooperate, we'll detain you and search the vehicle ourselves." Camille looked directly at him. "I am a federal law enforcement officer engaged in an active operation. Continuing this stop risks compromising work that extends far beyond the three of you standing here. Contact a supervisor through the appropriate channel, and my status can be confirmed." It was a simple solution. Had Brock accepted it, the encounter would have ended quietly. Instead, he dismissed the offer before she had even finished speaking. Anyone can claim they have some special number that proves their story. His refusal revealed more than anything Camille could have accused him of. This was no longer caution. It was stubbornness disguised as procedure. Reed reached for her door and pulled it open with unnecessary force. "Step out." His hand was already drifting toward the handcuffs on his belt, as though the outcome had been decided long before Camille was given an opportunity to comply. A small crowd began forming on the sidewalk. The lights, raised voices, and gathering officers drew residents from nearby buildings. Several people lifted their phones and began recording. The neighborhood had seen scenes like this before. An older man near the corner shook his head. "Same script every time," he muttered to the woman beside him. "Doesn't matter how calm the driver is." A teenager filming from across the street zoomed in on Camille's face. What stayed with him later was not the shouting or the flashing lights. It was her stillness. Even as Reed tightened his grip on her arm, she refused to let panic take control. The crowd should have made Nolan reconsider what he was doing. Instead, it encouraged him. He turned slightly toward the people watching, performing for them as much as for his fellow officers. He repeated his joke about everyone claiming to work for the government whenever they were stopped. A few uneasy laughs rose from the sidewalk. More faces showed discomfort. A woman near the front called out, "Let her explain herself." Reed ignored her and continued guiding Camille toward the rear of the patrol vehicle. Rain gathered along Camille's shoulders as she stood on the wet pavement. Her voice never rose. "You are interfering with a federal operation," she warned. "Every moment you continue this detention increases the damage." Brock waved the warning aside. "You can explain all of that at the station, if any of it turns out to be true." Then a black SUV appeared at the far end of the street. It moved with calm, deliberate confidence. Camille saw it before any of the officers did. For the first time, genuine urgency flashed across her face. The SUV belonged to the courier the task force had been tracking. It was the connection they needed to follow the robbery organization back to its source. Camille turned sharply toward Brock. "Release me now. That driver is the target of a federal investigation. If he sees this scene and leaves, you may destroy the only opportunity we have to trace the network." Brock did not believe her. To him, it sounded like a desperate story invented by someone trying to escape detention. "Hold her," he told Reed. Nolan kept filming. Inside the SUV, the courier noticed the flashing lights, the crowd, and the faint outline of a surveillance vehicle farther down the street. He recognized danger immediately. Without waiting to understand what had happened, he turned hard across the road and accelerated away. The task force's opportunity began disappearing with him. Extensive surveillance, financial analysis, and undercover positioning were unraveling on a nade-slicked street because 3 officers had decided that a woman in an old sedan looked suspicious. A radio hidden beneath Camille's coat suddenly came alive. "Marshal Langston, the target is moving. Confirm your status." The professional voice cut through the street with unmistakable clarity. All 3 officers froze. Brock's flashlight lowered. Reed's hand fell away from Camille's arm as though he had been burned. Nolan stopped performing for his phone. The color drained from his face as he finally understood that everything Camille had said was true. The response arrived with overwhelming force. Federal vehicles poured onto the block from multiple directions. Sirens rolled between the buildings. Headlights filled the rain. Agents from the FBI arrived alongside deputy marshals and personnel from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. They moved with the controlled urgency of a task force watching a carefully built operation collapse in real time. Supervisory Special Agent Gideon Shaw stepped from the lead vehicle, rain darkening his jacket almost immediately. His anger was barely contained. "Who detained Marshal Langston?" No one answered. Brock opened his mouth, but no useful explanation came. Reed stared at the pavement. Nolan's phone captured the sound of his own breathing, becoming shallow. Camille stepped forward and reached inside her coat. She removed a small leather case and opened it in one practiced motion. A gold federal badge caught the red and blue reflections around them. The crowd went silent. People who had been broadcasting the encounter forgot to narrate. Brock's face turned pale as the consequences of his decision finally became real. Gideon looked at the 3 officers. "You compromised Operation Iron Verdict." Each word landed like a door closing somewhere beyond their reach. Camille did not waste time humiliating them in return. The mission still mattered more than her anger. She climbed into the lead federal SUV and immediately began issuing directions over a secure channel. Coordinates, escape routes, surveillance positions, and requests for aerial support came from her with absolute clarity. The officers who had mocked her could only stand at the edge of the scene and watch. Moments earlier, they had treated her as powerless. Now, the crowd saw the person she had been all along, controlled, decisive, and worthy of every ounce of authority she carried. The pursuit cut through the city with enough tension to silence everyone listening over the command channel. The courier understood that he was being hunted. He drove through side streets, service lanes, and narrow alleys with the skill of someone who had prepared for this possibility. Federal vehicles followed without crowding him too early, knowing that panic could cause him to abandon the SUV and disappear into a neighborhood filled with hiding places. Camille studied the live tracking feed from the command vehicle. She had spent a long time learning the courier's habits, preferred roads, and connections to properties associated with the robbery crew. Every fragment of that knowledge mattered now. She predicted turns before he made them. She redirected units before he reached them. She transformed what could have become a reckless chase into a controlled containment operation. The courier moved toward the edge of the city, apparently hoping that crossing into another jurisdiction would create enough confusion for him to escape. Camille had already anticipated that possibility. Units were waiting along the roads most likely to carry him outward. When he doubled back through a narrow alley behind shuttered storefronts, he found another federal vehicle positioned beyond the exit. Camille had identified the alley during earlier reconnaissance and marked it as a likely evasive route. The courier cursed over an open transmission, jerked the wheel, and fled in another direction. Camille ordered a rolling roadblock farther along his projected path. She coordinated a low-flying helicopter above him and synchronized several ground teams so precisely that the courier entered a dead-end service road before he realized he had been guided there. There was no gunfire, no chaotic collision, no reckless display designed for cameras. There was only careful, disciplined coordination from a commander who understood that the mission mattered more than personal revenge. Federal vehicles closed around the SUV from every direction. The courier sat motionless behind the wheel, staring into a wall of headlights and calculating whether any path remained. There was none. Agents approached from multiple angles. The courier emerged with his hands raised, the fight leaving him the moment he understood that escape was impossible. He was taken into custody without further incident. A search connected to the arrest led agents to a warehouse filled with evidence. Inside, they found financial records, weapons, communications, and documentation linking the robbery crew to a network far larger than investigators had initially understood. The discovery changed the entire case. Agents who had worked on Iron Verdict gathered afterward, exhausted and relieved. Many reached the same conclusion. Without Camille's leadership during the pursuit, the organization would have disappeared after the officers compromised the surveillance stop. The case had survived despite their interference, not because of anything they had done. News of the encounter moved quickly through federal channels. The Department of Homeland Security opened a formal review, treating the stop not as an ordinary disciplinary matter, but as a serious breach that had nearly destroyed a classified operation. Investigators collected every available recording. They reviewed the officers' body cameras frame by frame. They examined the patrol vehicle's dashboard footage. They secured video from street cameras along the block. They preserved civilian recordings and live streams from the gathered crowd. Most damaging of all was the concealed federal camera inside Camille's sedan. It had captured the entire confrontation clearly, from the first unjustified question to the moment the courier escaped. Brock's remarks about Camille's car, registration, and demeanor were preserved in full. Every aggressive interruption from Reed was documented. Every attempt by Nolan to turn the encounter into entertainment remained recorded. Once Nolan understood how badly the video reflected on the officers, he tried to delete the footage from his phone. He did not know that the file had already synchronized with department cloud storage. The attempt failed. It also became additional evidence of his poor judgment. The truth was no longer open to competing interpretations. Multiple cameras showed the same sequence. Camille had cooperated. She had offered lawful verification. The officers had refused it. They had initiated the confrontation without legitimate cause, escalated it through assumption, and obstructed a federal investigation because they were too proud to reconsider their first impression. All three officers were suspended while the review continued. Their badges and service weapons were surrendered according to procedure. The formal hearing was held in a municipal room that had witnessed many disciplinary cases, though few carried consequences this serious. At the front sat the police chief, an internal affairs representative, and an observer from the Department of Justice. The presence of federal oversight made clear that the department could not handle the matter quietly behind closed doors. The panel reconstructed the stop piece by piece. Recordings were paused, replayed, and compared with radio transmissions. Investigators identified the exact moment Camille offered a lawful method to verify her identity and the exact moment Brock dismissed it. They noted that nearly every escalation came from the officers. Camille had not threatened them. She had not resisted. She had not raised her voice. She had simply refused to compromise a federal case and insisted that they follow proper procedure. The conclusions were direct. The stop had been initiated without sufficient cause. The officers had abused their authority. Their actions had been driven by assumption rather than evidence. Their conduct had obstructed a federal operation and endangered work performed by agents, analysts, technicians, and support personnel whose efforts had never been visible to the public. The Department of Justice observer added that incidents like this harmed far more than the person standing beside the road. They weakened trust between law enforcement and the communities officers were sworn to serve. They also made the work of honest officers more difficult by confirming the fears of people who had learned to expect humiliation instead of protection. Camille sat quietly in the gallery throughout the hearing. She declined repeated opportunities to condemn the men publicly. When the panel finally asked whether she wished to speak, she stood. Her voice carried no bitterness, even though bitterness would have been understandable. "A badge has meaning only when it is carried with responsibility," she said. "Authority without accountability is nothing more than a costume. An officer is not measured by the power he holds, but by how he treats the person standing before him who appears to hold none." The room fell completely silent. Even the federal observer lowered his eyes and wrote the words into his notes. The police chief announced that the final decision would follow after the panel completed its review, though everyone present already understood what the evidence demanded. The consequences were severe. Sergeant Brock Hensley was stripped of his rank and terminated. His seniority could not protect him from conduct documented so completely. He left the building without addressing the reporters gathered outside. His career in law enforcement was effectively over, and the record of the incident would follow him anywhere he tried to rebuild it. Officer Reed Callahan was dismissed as well. His earlier complaints were reopened, revealing that the encounter with Camille belonged to a broader pattern rather than being an isolated failure. What had once resulted in minor reprimands now appeared for what it was: repeated aggression that the department should have confronted much sooner. Rookie Nolan Vance received a different outcome. The panel considered his inexperience and the fact that he had not physically restrained Camille. He was ordered into extensive retraining and received a permanent disciplinary mark. It was a second chance, but not an absolution. Whether he would use it to become the kind of officer his community needed remained uncertain. The answer would depend entirely on the choices he made after seeing where blind admiration and performative cruelty had led him. Operation Iron Verdict, meanwhile, became a major federal success. The organization behind the armored transport robberies was dismantled piece by piece. Its leader was convicted on charges serious enough to remove him from the streets permanently. Stolen assets worth millions were recovered. The courier agreed to cooperate, and his testimony helped prosecutors identify those above him in the organization. Evidence recovered from the warehouse proved even more valuable than investigators expected. Financial ledgers documented laundered proceeds. Communication records linked criminal cells that had previously appeared unrelated. Weapons stored inside suggested that future robberies would have become far more violent had the task force failed. None of it would have been found without the pursuit Camille commanded after being treated with contempt on the side of the road. By any reasonable measure, she had every excuse to be shaken. Instead, she did her job. Camille received a formal commendation during a private ceremony attended mainly by colleagues who understood what the operation had required from her. When invited to speak, she redirected most of the praise toward the task force. Her remarks were brief. "A badge does not make anyone worthy of respect," she said. "The way we treat people does." Those were the words everyone remembered. Later, Camille climbed back into the same aging sedan and left the federal building where Iron Verdict had been formally closed. The weather had cleared. Sunlight broke through the gray sky and touched the worn paint of the vehicle that had once made 3 officers decide she was suspicious. Traffic moved slowly through downtown. At a red light, a young officer in the next lane glanced toward her and offered a polite nod. He had no idea who she was. He did not recognize her rank, her service record, or the operation she had saved. His courtesy required none of that. Camille returned the nod with a faint smile. When the light changed, she continued into the ordinary flow of the city. She resumed her work without seeking publicity. New assignments arrived. Interview requests were declined. Colleagues who tried to turn the incident into a legend found that Camille had little interest in becoming one. A newly assigned deputy eventually asked how she had remained so calm while 3 officers insulted and detained her. Camille considered the question before answering. "Losing control would have accomplished nothing," she said. "It would only have given them the reaction they expected. In that moment, the only power I had was refusing to hand it to them." The neighborhood where the stop occurred changed in quieter ways. The police department introduced new training on identification, verification, and de-escalation. Community leaders used the publicly available footage in forums addressing bias and the danger of assumption-driven policing. None of those changes erased what Camille endured. They did, however, allow something useful to grow from it. The encounter had never truly been about federal vehicles, rank, or the dramatic sight of agents arriving to correct a mistake. It was about the assumptions people carried without examining them. It was about the dignity of a woman who refused to surrender her composure even while strangers treated her as less than she was. And it was about a truth no badge, uniform, or flashing light could replace. Respect is not granted automatically by authority. It is earned through the decisions people make when they believe no one important is watching. It is earned through restraint, fairness, and the willingness to see the person standing before you fully before deciding you already know who they are. Long after iron verdict closed and public attention moved elsewhere, residents still spoke about the night. The street fell silent. They remembered the rain. They remembered the federal convoy appearing without warning. And they remembered the moment. 3 officers learned that judging someone by the surface of things would eventually expose far more about them than about the person they had chosen to condemn. Camille rarely spoke of the incident. She carried the memory the same way she carried everything else in a career built on discipline, quiet courage, and a mind that kept observing long after everyone else had decided they understood the whole story.